The case attracted attention not because of its brutality or scale, but because of its structure. It is an internal process that rarely becomes public knowledge. It all began with ordinary prison correspondence between three convicts. A prisoner serving time for an economic crime found herself the focus of attention of two men at once. The consequences of this relationship were deadly. Grace Ellen Coulter was convicted in 2021 of a series of fraudulent operations involving check forgery and identity theft against elderly people. She was 29 years old at the time of her arrest. A native of Northern California with no prior criminal record, she did not arouse suspicion among neighbors or relatives. However, investigators found that her operation spanned at least 3 years, causing significant financial losses to more than 14 individuals. At the Lynn County Jail, where she was transferred after her sentence, Grace established herself as a soft, outgoing and low-conflict inmate. According to internal reports from correctional staff, she was active in literature clubs, kept a low profile and barely stood out in her first months. However, beginning in January 2022, her activity inside the prison changed. Testimony from other prisoners, later collected during an internal investigation, described Coulter's behavior as careful and calculating. She willingly took it upon herself to help other prisoners with letters, complaints, and statements. She became particularly close to several men in the men's wing of the prison, with whom prisoners in the women's sector could correspond through the official internal correspondence system. One of the first to actively communicate with her was Sylvain Trust, a 34-year-old convicted of illegal possession of a weapon and armed entry. He was in medium-level isolation and had limited privileges. The correspondence with Grace began, he says, after a literary group he was given access to through the prison's rehabilitation program. The letters between them quickly became regular. In them, as it later turned out, Grace skillfully maintained a balance between emotional closeness and formal distance. She asked about Sylvain's affairs, shared details of his daily routine, without crossing the line of intimate communication. This allowed her to remain in the field of sympathy, but avoid direct obligations. Around the same time she began corresponding with another inmate, Marco Hellman, 37, who had been convicted of grand larceny and escaped from prison. He had a higher status in the prison hierarchy than Trust, with access to more resources and respect in his cell. Psychological observation of Grace did not record any alarming changes in her behavior. She did not violate the regime, did not enter into conflicts, was not noticed in manipulative actions with the staff. However, both correspondences began to develop in parallel, and Coulter herself, according to the testimony of her cellmates, consciously selected the words and topics in the letters in order to maintain the interest of both men. Forensic experts would later conclude that Grace had acted deliberately, exploiting each man's individual weaknesses. In her letters to the Trust, she focused on trust, loneliness, and a possible future outside prison. With Marco she was more direct, touching on finances, connections outside, and the prospects for protection in the event of a conflict. At this point, no one in the facility's administration had recorded any reason to intervene. The correspondence did not violate any rules, and neither party filed any formal complaints. However, the letters began to show signs of growing dependency, at least in one of the men. This became the starting point for the events that would end in tragedy. Just over 2 months had passed since the correspondence between Grace Coulter and the two prisoners began. According to the rules of the institution, all letters were pre-screened, but the actual volume of incoming correspondence and the limited staff meant that a significant portion of the letters were only reviewed selectively. Letters between Grace and Sylvain Trust began arriving twice a week. Their content was loosely bounded by the established boundaries, domestic details, weather conditions, prison activities and general reflections on life. But analysis of letters seized during the subsequent investigation revealed that Grace gradually increased the emotional pressure, introducing themes of trust, personal loyalty and jealousy. In one letter, dated February 18th, she wrote to Trust, "I don't know who here really hears me except you. Only you want nothing from me but the real thing." Meanwhile, her correspondence with Marco Hellman was more utilitarian and, according to experts, calculating. These letters discussed prison relationships, the system of informal exchange of goods, and topics related to protection within the block. Marco had influence and was able to provide Grace with certain preferences. Through dummy prisoners he passed her cigarettes, coffee, and sometimes personal hygiene products. Although contact between the male and female wings was officially prohibited, the system of informal connections made it possible to organize such transfers. In mid-March, one of the guards reported to the senior curator of the block that he had seen third parties transfer a package from Hellman to the women's sector, bypassing the established procedure. However, due to the lack of direct evidence and statements, no action was taken at that time. An examination of the correspondence suggests that both prisoners were convinced of their specialness to Grace. Trust, less experienced in the prison environment, was emotionally attached. In one letter he wrote, "I wait for your words like air. I don't know what I would do if you suddenly stopped writing." Hellman, on the other hand, was more reserved, but his letters showed signs of control. "I advise you not to associate with those who have nothing to offer you. You are smarter than you look." Testimony from other inmates during the investigation confirmed that rumors began to circulate in the men's block that both inmates were in contact with the same woman. Although they had no evidence to back up the allegations, tensions between Trust and Hellman began to mount. According to one witness, Trust began to avoid social activities and lost interest in rehabilitation programs. His behavior became withdrawn, often requesting extra hours of silence in his cell. At the same time, Hellman, on the contrary, demonstrated a feigned calm. He continued to participate in the life of the block, interacted with the guards, and sometimes spoke publicly about cheap feelings and women's games. Although he did not directly name names according to the block's employees, it was clear to whom he was addressing. This increased the tension in the relationships between the prisoners. Signals of an impending conflict began trickling into the facility's internal reports. One officer mentioned that the Trust was in an unstable emotional state, while another recorded a complaint from a third prisoner who claimed that Marco was turning women into tools. Despite this, no concrete action was taken by the administration. There were no formal violations, and correspondence was not grounds for disciplinary action. Grace, according to her cellmates, remained calm and confident. She continued to write both sets of letters and received regular responses. When asked by one of the women in her cell if she was afraid the men would find out about each other, she replied, "They're too busy with themselves to realize that I'm the same person." The system, built on paper correspondence and minimal monitoring, did not allow for the prompt identification of double contact. While a situation capable of leading to tragic consequences was developing inside the institution, at the official level everything continued to look within the norm. Beginning in late March 2022, signs of internal conflict began to emerge in the men's block of the Lynn County Jail. Informal observations of the behavior of Sylvain Trust and Marco Hellman suggested underlying tension. Although there were no direct confrontations between the two, their interaction patterns changed markedly. They avoided being in the common room at the same time, ate at different times, and stopped participating in joint activities. Guards interpreted this as a normal sphere of influence, a common occurrence in prison settings that does not require immediate intervention. However, by April 4th, Trust's first disciplinary card for verbal abuse appeared in prison records. According to the report, he shouted at another prisoner, demanding that he not repeat gossip. When interviewed by guards, Trust refused to say what was discussed, but witnesses to the incident said Grace Coulter's name was discussed. The following week, Marco Hellman was called in for an emergency interview after an inmate reported pressure from him. In an informal conversation, Hellman acknowledged that he controlled the dissemination of information within the block, but said that it was not the management's business, and that people know who they can talk to and who they can't. A psychologist observing the prisoners recorded increased anxiety in Trust. He began to sleep poorly, refused to go to the library and clubs, and avoided communication even with his former cellmates. His letters to Grace became increasingly obsessive, with elements of accusations and jealousy. In one letter written on April 9th, he noted, "I still believe you, but why do you sometimes keep silent for so long? You promised that we would not play with each other." Grace's letters, according to subsequent analysis, did not change significantly. She continued to maintain two separate lines of communication, maintaining both contacts with a difference in tone. With Trust softly, with hints of feeling, with Hellman more rational and concrete, often discussing domestic needs and the system of transferring resources. Meanwhile, conflicts began to arise in Trust's cell. His cellmate filed a written complaint, claiming that Trust spends all his time sitting on his bunk, writing in a notebook, and often talks to himself. The complaint was not recognized as grounds for review of his conditions of detention, but a copy was added to his personnel file. Shortly before the incident that would later become the subject of an investigation, a surprise inspection was conducted in Hellman's 3B cell. Unauthorized items were found in his cell: 2 packs of cigarettes, a Swiss Army knife, and empty plastic containers used for informal transfers between units. Hellman was given a warning, but given his stable behavioral status, no further action was taken. Rumors of a conflict about to arise began to circulate within the prison. According to 2 prisoners who testified at the inquiry, Trust mentioned several times that some things need to be settled. One witness claimed to have heard Trust say that sometimes there's only one way to protect a woman. Neither side sought formal help. Grace Coulter, despite receiving letters with clear signs of emotional abuse, made no request to cease correspondence. In fact, she continued to reply, including in phrases that experts would later regard as provocative. In one letter to the Trust on April 11, she wrote, "You know I have no control over what others think. If you believe me you stay, if you don't you go." Despite the recorded complaints and alarm signals, the staff of the institution did not take coordinated steps to de-escalate the conflict. This was argued by the fact that every prisoner has the right to personal correspondence and independent conclusions. Neither Trust nor Hellman underwent additional psychological examination, and Grace herself remained outside the observation zone, since she did not formally violate the established rules. The existing system within the isolation unit did not allow for the exchange of operational information between units in real time. Against the backdrop of this lack of response, an event occurred that disrupted the usual routine of the institution and led to the initiation of a criminal investigation outside the framework of the penitentiary procedure. On April 12, 2022 at 6:43, the duty officer of Block 2B, Senior Warden Jose Milton, discovered the body of inmate Sylvain Trust in cell 27B during his morning round. According to the report, the cell door was locked from the inside, with no violations in the locking system. Trust was in a sitting position on the bottom bunk, with his head down, and showed no signs of life. Nearby on the floor was a makeshift sharp object, a sharpened plastic toothbrush body wrapped in duct tape. Prison medical staff were promptly called in. At 6:58, the death was officially confirmed. In accordance with procedure, an emergency evacuation of prisoners from adjacent cells was carried out. Recording of all movements in the block for the previous 12 hours was started, surveillance logs and video recordings were seized. A preliminary examination of the body revealed multiple stab wounds to the chest area, including 3 that penetrated the pleura. Cuts and bruises were found on Trust's hands, indicating an attempt at self-defense. Heavy bleeding from the main wounds occurred approximately 20 to 30 minutes before discovery. No evidence of forced entry into the cell was found, ruling out the possibility of third-party penetration. The forensic examination confirmed that death occurred between 5:45 and 6:15. No traces of drugs or psychoactive substances were found in Trust's body. Physical weakness of the body is noted against the background of stress and malnutrition. In recent days he refused to eat, which is confirmed by internal reports of the unit. The investigation team that arrived that day found handwritten sheets of paper in the cell, 8 pages, presumably handwritten by Trust. Their content was not clearly stated, but several pages mentioned betrayal, feelings associated with deception, and a woman who said everything would be fair. Handwriting analysis later confirmed the authorship. One fragment reads, "I was someone to her, but I didn't know there were 2 like me. One of us has to go. If it's me, so be it." Several fragments of letters, presumably from Grace, were also found, but their condition made it impossible to determine their full contents. At the same time, investigators paid attention to the behavior of Marco Hellman. According to the guards, on the night of April 12, he left his cell twice with permission from the duty officer. Once to visit the sanitary block, the second time, allegedly due to problems with the sewage system. Video recordings confirmed Hellman's movements along the corridor, but his presence near cell 27B was not recorded. The camera in this sector was temporarily out of order due to a malfunction recorded the day before. When questioned, Hellman denied any involvement, saying he knew the Trust was unstable, and was surprised the administration had not done anything sooner. He denied knowledge of the parallel correspondence with Grace Coulter, claiming he did not concern himself with other people's affairs. However, several prisoners confirmed that 2 days before the incident they heard Hellman say in the common yard, "Whoever can't handle the pressure had better get out of the game early." Although there was no direct threat in the words, in the context of the circumstances it was recorded by the investigation as potentially significant. Grace Coulter was placed under administrative investigation. She was temporarily removed from outside contact, had all correspondence for the past 3 months confiscated, and was ordered to undergo additional psychological counseling. When first interviewed, she remained calm, stating that she didn't expect this outcome, and thought men were just competing with each other, as is usually the case. Her testimony did not contain direct admissions of provoking the conflict, but according to investigators, it was her behavior, based on parallel manipulation, that became the catalyst for the conflict. The prison's internal commission acknowledged that the system of control over correspondence was ineffective and did not ensure a timely response to potential risks. The murder of Sylvain Trust was the first reported fatal incident in Unit 2B in 6 years. The facility's administration has launched an internal investigation, and the case has been forwarded to the district attorney's office for further action on possible solicitation of murder and staff negligence. The Lynn County District Attorney's Office completed its initial investigation in late May 2022. Marco Hellman was formally charged with the murder of Sylvain Trust, but an investigation into Grace Coulter's role as a possible instigator began in parallel. The basis for this was written materials seized from the deceased cell, as well as her own correspondence recorded 3 months before the incident. The case against Hellman was built on circumstantial evidence. His repeated appearances near Trust's cell, inmate testimony about his words 2 days before his death, and his access to items suitable for making homemade weapons. But there was no direct evidence, no fingerprints or recordings, that clearly linked him to the attack. The case was complicated by the fact that Trust, according to the conclusions of a forensic psychiatric examination, was in a state of emotional instability bordering on suicidal. Experts did not rule out the possibility that he could have inflicted injuries on himself, although the nature of the wounds remained controversial. As a result, the murder charge against Hellman was dropped, and he was transferred to a segregated unit without new charges. The prosecution's position on Grace Coulter was that her behavior showed signs of systematic psychological manipulation. She was charged with creating conditions that led to serious consequences and violating the internal rules of detention. At a court hearing in July, excerpts from letters were read in which she encouraged jealous behavior, hinted at privilege and loyalty, and used phrases with emotional load. Coulter herself pleaded not guilty. In her testimony, she claimed that she had no idea what her correspondence would lead to, and that responsibility for the men's actions lay solely with them. Her defense insisted that any emotional or psychological consequences were the result of Trust's personal characteristics, and that Grace was merely exchanging legitimate correspondence. However, the court found her actions to have contributed to the escalation of the conflict and added 3 years to her sentence for knowingly causing unlawful conduct resulting in the death of a person. It was also decided to transfer Coulter to another institution with a stricter regime and a ban on correspondence with prisoners in the male units for at least 2 years. Following the case, the Oregon Department of Corrections initiated a review of its prison correspondence policy, implementing new automated email review procedures and restricting access to multi-channel correspondence. Official reports labeled the incident as an example of lost control when there are hidden social dynamics among inmates.